On today's episode, we have our guest, David Kula, and we're going to be talking about the Orthodox stance on war. Now, David, in the Orthodox faith, we'll give a very quick answer before we go into the lecture. Can one become a police officer in the Orthodox faith? Can one join the military in the Orthodox faith? Or is that against the faith?
The Orthodox faith is not one in which any particular socialist state is held in any greater regard than any other socialist state. The spiritual challenges for human beings are the same, no matter what they are doing, whether they're police officers, judges, whether they're serving in the military. The spiritual challenges are always the same, which is, how do I do everything I can do to bear witness to the lover of the world? How do I do everything I can do to call forth grace, to be compassionate, a person who brings life from death? I would say that we need police officers, soldiers, judges who hold that dear, and for whom that also becomes part of how they understand their work. Well, it's so, the whole question of Christians and war, or Christians and soldiers, is one that goes all the way back, really, to the very, very early church.
Now, I do know in church history we do have some saints who actually served in the Roman military. So, can you serve in the military if you're Orthodox, or do you have to be a pacifist? I'm trying to understand this.
Well, of course, there are many Orthodox saints who were soldiers. So the issue in the very early church, and even prior to the church becoming anything other than a countercultural movement, there were Roman soldiers who became Christian, continued to be Roman soldiers, and sought advice on how they should behave and how that should play itself out. And we see something similar in the Reformation period. So, war is in a sense the end of politics. The great German thinker about war always used to argue that war was politics by another name. But I disagree with him. I think war is the end of politics. The Orthodox, well, we have to remember that Orthodox understanding develops over a period of time. And Orthodox authorities who have under their homophorium their particular congregations and faithful, they will have a variety of perspectives on what ought to happen if in fact their area is under assault or going to war. I remember how struck I was in Serbia to see in some of the great medieval churches of Serbia, to see how ubiquitous the icons were, the frescoes were, of soldier saints in that tradition. So we need to remember that in the very early church, the Christians were counterculture. That Jesus Christ speaks about laying your life down, not about taking up arms. The Apostle Paul struggles with this question. Once the church becomes both legitimate in the empire and also ostensibly a ministry of the empire, this becomes a problematic matter. Because the empire has its requirements. So under those circumstances, Christian thinkers struggle with this question. And some of them certainly make arguments worthy of a Jesuit that you can be a soldier, but you have to abide by certain kinds of moral code. The issue of war and the church's stance in the face of it really comes to the fore in the 16th century. Prior to that, there isn't a lot of discussion about it. But in the 16th century, with the Reformation in Europe, and then the outbreak of what we usually refer to as the 30 Years' War, an absolute and utter catastrophe for Western Europe. Some historians say 25, 30, 35% of the population of Western Europe was killed in that 30-year period. And it included all the religious leaders, most of the political leaders, most of the artists and intellectuals. It was an amazing purgation. Why did it happen? Well, it happened because Martin Luther, John Calvin, the Anabaptist tradition, they come out of the Reformation, they seek to recover the church in a more purified form, but along with it comes the nation state. It's born with it. So then you get religious communities which are bound to particular German princes, to particular kinds of authority. So in that period, coming out of the devastation of the 30 Years' War, the large Christian churches and the Christian tradition of theology begins to think through this matter. And there are really three ways in which they respond. One of the theologies that develops is the theology of a holy crusade. It's important to remember that while Europe is tearing itself apart with the 30 Years' War, we also had Islam coming from the south, up through into Spain. So you had many Christians in Western Europe feeling under attack, both on the inside, certainly the Catholics on the inside, they felt under attack with the Reformation, and then the Crusades and the rise of a new empire. A new empire to challenge, Luther had challenged the Holy Roman Empire. So, and 1453, the Byzantine Empire fell at the hands of Ahmet the Great when they breached the walls of Constantinople that Tuesday afternoon. And then you have the new Muslim empire pushing itself into Europe. So in that circumstance, some developed a theology of the Holy Crusade. You could go on the crusade to Jerusalem, and if you do that, and if you're killed, all your sins will be forgiven. It's exactly the same kind of theology that we heard a little bit about with the rise of Al-Qaeda. It's the Islamic form of it. The second sort of theological contribution about the nature of war and the Christian stance in the face of war was a just war theory. Now that theory goes back to Plato and Aristotle. They thought about what constitutes a just war. Now we have to be careful. That doesn't mean a war is justified. It means that if you want if there needs to be certain criteria for you to be able to engage in war and think of it as, since no war is justifiable, it is as justifiable as a war can be. And the standard view was that you have to be under attack. Your people have to be under attack, so it must be defensive. Another principle was that you have to use a proportionate response to the warfare that's been put upon you. Another principle was you need to shape things in a way so that you can achieve your goal of the protection of your community within a reasonable length of time. Now, Martin Luther, he takes this Greek tradition and he develops it and makes biblical justifications for it. As you know, you can pick and choose from the scripture, and you can virtually justify anything you wish. So Luther develops that. He develops it sadly, that is, not triumphantly, and I think that for a very good reason. Because when Luther threw down the gauntlet and nailed the theses to the door of the church at Wittenberg, that was a challenge to the Pope and to the Holy Roman Empire. When it collapsed, when he, in a sense, won, the princes then also said, yeah, let's support Luther because we don't have to pay taxes to the emperor or to Rome. So what goes around comes around. So then the peasants said, why should, if the lords and princes don't have to pay taxes to the emperor and to the pope, why do we have to pay taxes to you? And we have the huge rebellion that develops and tremendous iconoclasm, the burning of churches, the destruction of artistic works. And this caught Luther by surprise. And he finally had to come out and make an argument that revolution and chaos is against the divine order. So Luther's basic view, and this has to do with the notion also that has interested you of the relationship between the church and the state, Luther's view was that there are two sovereign spheres. The one of them is that sphere which has to do with the divine and the church's primary concern there. And the other one has to do with secular power and the need to render to Caesar what's Caesar's, but not more than that, not more than that. So Luther writes a very interesting thing about the soldier and how the soldier can be a Christian but still be a soldier. And it has to do with being a soldier with a particular kind of moral compass. John Calvin was also had a kind of just war theory that he talked about. But there's a third one, and the third one is called yieldedness. And to my mind, this is the most interesting contribution to thinking about war from the perspective of faith that we have in the development of Protestantism. In fact, in the development of Christianity. And that was developed by the Anabaptist movement. And the Anabaptist movement, of course, the Radical Reformation, they had a very strong position that if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, if you are a follower of the Prince of Peace, then under no circumstances, none, can you exercise violence, not even to protect yourself or your family. You are a follower of the Prince of Peace. You must do what the Prince of Peace did. You must lay down your life, even for your enemy. So it's a profound I think, corrective to both just war theory as well as the notion of a holy crusade. But of course, it's not a view that can be applied by a government, because governments have as their first responsibility the protection of the community. So the Orthodox tradition is forged initially in the period of persecution under the Roman emperors, the pagan Roman emperors. It then becomes a bureaucracy of the state. But we must remember, when Constantine ended the persecution and then took the state, or took the church into the state, that there were many men and women who went to the desert. So the church at that point has sort of two arms to it. It has your local churches with your bishops who have usually a good relationship to the politicians. But you also had the desert fathers and mothers. And they were listening to a different drummer. They were much more radical. So we have within Orthodoxy both of these functioning, both efforts to justify and argue that the interests of the state, which may lead to war, somehow should be even at times sanctified or blessed by clergy and bishops. But we also have the opposite, where that is seen as we have another third period, which is so significant for Orthodox history, and that is the conquest of Islam. When the Byzantine Empire falls in 1453, much of the Orthodox Christian community is now under the Sultan, is now under Islam. And so the question is, how do they, in that circumstance, understand their relationship to power and to politics? It's very striking. And that period continues. This is amazing when you think of it. It continues to the end of the end of the Second World War. No, pardon me, the end of the First World War. It continues to the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the last Muslim empire. So 1920. And and of course there's the development of the secular state of Turkey with the end of the Ottoman Empire. So Orthodox thinkers and Orthodox believers for that whole period are living under not a Christian emperor, because that created particular kinds of issues that had to be addressed, but now they're living under a sultan who does not share their faith. And then, of course, 1917 comes along. And we find the rise of Bolshevism and the development of the Soviet Union. And so then Orthodox churches in the Slavic world largely enter into a new persecution under Bolshevism, which has an official atheist ideology. So the Orthodox Church has been pretty mottled in its understanding of these issues, and I would largely say so because it has been off balance under the Ottomans and under the Bolsheviks. But what is wonderful about it, even if it's so modest, what is wonderful about it is that there have always been men and women in the Orthodox Church who have pointed to the Prince of Peace, who have said that our task as Christians is to pull life from death. It is not to deepen the sorrow. It's not to extend the death. It's to pull life from death, even if that means we must lay down our own life to do that. So orthodoxy doesn't have a formulated theology of yieldedness like the Anabaptists do. But if you look at the life of Orthodox saints, you will find it modeled and taught there in a very rich way.